The chill of the zipper against my spine was a sharp contrast to the warmth flooding my cheeks as I stared at my reflection. The woman in the mirror, a stranger swathed in ivory silk. "Oh, Linda," I breathed, my fingers tracing the delicate lace appliques on the bodice. It was the dress, the one I'd pointed out to David for months, a silent prayer whispered every time we passed the boutique window. He'd just grunted, his mind always a million miles away, usually on a spreadsheet or a client call. But today, for our 35th anniversary dinner, he'd surprised me, pushing me gently through the doors of elegance and insisting I try it on. "My beautiful wife deserves a crown," he'd said, his voice unusually thick. "But this will have to do." Now, standing here, I felt a flutter of the girl I used to be, the one he'd married all those years ago, before mortgages and college tuitions and the quiet, comfortable dust of a long marriage had settled over us. The dressing room was a plush, velvet-lined cubicle, but the world beyond its curtain felt distant, muffled. That's when I heard his voice. Not the gentle, coaxing tone from minutes before, but a low, sharp whisper that carried the unmistakable charge of a secret. "Yeah, it's done. The loan's approved. She has no idea." My breath hitched. She? Who is she? The question was a cold stone dropping into the warm pool of my happiness. I stood frozen, the silk suddenly feeling like a shroud. My hand pressed against the curtain, not daring to pull it back. David's voice dropped even lower, a conspiratorial murmur. "As soon as the funds hit, I'm gone."
I can't do this anymore, Patricia. I just can't. Patricia. The name was a physical blow. Patricia was my oldest friend, the one who'd held my hand through my mother's funeral, who knew the recipe for my meatloaf by heart, whose laughter had echoed in my kitchen for 3 decades. The fitting room walls seemed to tilt, the flattering light now harsh, exposing every new line on my face, every silver thread in my hair. This wasn't a surprise anniversary gift. It was a farewell party, and I was the only one who didn't know it was ending. I remembered his strange insistence that morning that I update my will, just in case, he'd said with a strained laugh. I remembered the new, secretive passcode on his phone. The pieces, once isolated quirks, now clicked together into a monstrous, terrifying picture. He was leaving me. He was leaving me for Patricia, and he was taking something, a loan, a large one, from an account I knew nothing about, with him. The curtain rustled. "Linda, you decent in there? Let me see, honey." His voice was back to normal, a perfect imitation of the loving husband, and the dissonance made me nauseous. I had to move, to speak, to breathe. I yanked the curtain back, the metal rings screeching in protest. The smile on my face felt like it was carved from wood. "Well," I asked, my voice trembling only slightly, "what do you think?" David's eyes, those familiar blue eyes I'd woken up to for 35 years, swept over me. There was a flicker in them, something complex and pained that I might have mistaken for awe yesterday. Today, I saw it for what it was. Guilt. "Stunning," he whispered, but the word felt hollow, a cheap ornament. "You look absolutely stunning." He pulled out his wallet, his movements brisk, efficient. "We'll take it," he told the hovering sales assistant. I stood there, a mannequin in a stolen moment, the words, "She has no idea," echoing in the hollowed-out chamber of my heart, wondering how I was going to make it through dinner, through the night, through the rest of my life now that I knew everything. The restaurant was a constellation of soft candlelight and the gentle clink of crystal, a world away from the garish fluorescence of the dressing room, but I might as well have been sitting in a freezer. The ivory dress, once a symbol of a dream, now felt like a costume for a play that had already closed, the fabric itching against my skin with every forced, graceful movement. David held my chair, his hand brushing my shoulder, and I had to suppress a flinch. He ordered for us both, his voice a smooth, confident baritone that the waiter responded to with deferential nods, just as he always did.
And a bottle of the Dom Perignon, please, he added with a warm smile aimed at me. For my beautiful wife. The words, once a balm, were now a corrosive acid eating away at my composure. I watched his hands, the same hands that had built a treehouse for our son, Michael, that had held mine through 2 labors, that had just signed away some part of our future with a secret loan, and I wondered when they had become strangers. He was narrating a story about a client at work, his gestures animated, his laugh easy, and I realized with a sickening jolt that he was a brilliant performer. This entire evening, this entire last year perhaps, had been an act. "You're quiet tonight, Lynn," he said, his head tilting, the picture of concerned husband. "Everything okay? You love the lobster here." I looked at the pink-shelled creature on my plate, its body cracked open and exposed. "Just taking it all in," I managed, my voice a thin thread. "It's also perfect." And it was. A perfectly staged lie. The champagne arrived, its pop like a gunshot that made me jump. David didn't seem to notice. He raised his glass, his eyes glistening in the candlelight. "To 35 years," he said, his voice swelling with an emotion I could no longer trust. "To the most wonderful woman I know." I lifted my own flute, the bubbles dancing like tiny, frantic lives. My mind was racing, trying to calculate the loan, the reasons. Was it for an apartment? For her? Patricia had just renovated her kitchen, a sleek, modern thing she'd shown off with pride. Had David funded that? The pieces were a jigsaw puzzle of betrayal, and I couldn't see the whole picture, only the sharp, painful edges. "I saw Patricia last week," I said, the name feeling like ash on my tongue. I watched him closely. A flicker, so fast it was almost imperceptible, a tightening at the corner of his eye before his smile widened. "Oh yeah, how's she doing? Still complaining about her contractor?" He took a slow sip of champagne, his gaze steady over the rim of the glass. It was a perfect, casual response. Too perfect. "She seemed happy," I pressed, my heart hammering against my ribs. Lighter, somehow, like a weight had been lifted. David set his glass down precisely on the white tablecloth. "Well, that's good. She deserves some happiness after everything with her divorce." He reached across the table, covering my hand with his. His skin was warm, his touch once the safest place I knew. Now it felt like a brand. "But enough about Patricia. Tonight is about us." His thumb stroked my knuckles, and the intimacy of the gesture, now so fraudulent, was a physical agony. I felt the scream building in my chest, a silent, tearing pressure that threatened to shatter the delicate crystal and the even more delicate facade we were maintaining. I wanted to yank my hand back, to stand up and shout the truth to the entire restaurant, to watch his carefully constructed world crumble around him. But I didn't. I saw our son Michael's face, the worry that would cloud his eyes. I saw the gossiping tongues of our friends. I saw the utter, humiliating wreckage of my life laid bare for everyone to pity. So I left my hand there, trapped under his, and smiled back. I took a sip of the champagne, its celebrated taste like vinegar, and I knew with a cold, clear certainty that this was a war, not a surrender. He thought I had no idea. That was his one fatal mistake. The loan was approved. He was gone. But I was still here, and I was just beginning to fight for what was mine. The lobster meat, once a delicacy I savored, turned to a pasty, flavorless pulp in my mouth. Each forced swallow a small act of vengeance against my own crumbling composure. I cut another piece, the silver knife scraping against the fine china with a sound that seemed to scream in the hushed room, and I made myself chew, made myself meet David's gaze across the table, as if my world hadn't just been hollowed out. He was talking about retirement now, a subject that had always been a shared dream, a fantasy we'd woven together on lazy Sunday mornings. "I was thinking maybe a little place on the coast," he said, his eyes taking on a distant, wistful glaze that I now recognized not as nostalgia, but as rehearsal. "Somewhere with a porch where we can watch the waves, just you and me." Just you and me. The lie was so audacious, so perfectly crafted to lull me into a false sense of security that a strange, hysterical laugh bubbled up in my throat. I disguised it as a cough, reaching for my water glass with a hand I commanded to be steady.
He was already there, on that porch. But in his mind, was I the one sitting in the rocking chair beside him? Or was it Patricia, her laugh mingling with the sound of the gulls? The image was so vivid, so violently painful, that for a moment the restaurant tilted, the candle flames blurring into streaks of gold. "That sounds lovely," I heard myself say, my voice a ghost of itself. "A fresh start." He beamed, a genuine, relieved smile that struck me as the cruelest thing of all. He thought he was getting away with it. He thought the safe, predictable landscape of our life together was the perfect camouflage for his escape. He reached into his jacket pocket, the same pocket I'd seen him withdraw his phone from in the fitting room, and pulled out a small velvet box. My heart didn't flutter, it seized, a cold, hard knot in my chest. "I know the dress was the main event," he said, his voice softening in a way that had once made me feel cherished. "But I saw this last week, and I couldn't resist." He pushed the box across the table. With fingers that felt numb and thick, I opened it. Nestled inside was a necklace, a single, flawless, pear-shaped diamond hanging from a delicate platinum chain. It was breathtaking. It was expensive. It was a payoff. A beautiful, glittering consolation prize for a life he was about to obliterate. "David," I whispered, the tears that sprang to my eyes now completely real, but born of a desolation he mistook for joy. It's too much." "Nothing is too much for you, Linda," he said, and the conviction in his voice was terrifying. He came around the table, his movements sure and practiced, and fastened the clasp at the nape of my neck. The stone felt cold and heavy against my skin, a brand of his deceit. As his fingers brushed my neck, I remembered the first time he'd put a necklace on me, a simple turquoise bead on a leather string he'd bought from a street vendor on our honeymoon. His hands had trembled then. Now they were steady as a surgeon's. He returned to his seat, his expression one of profound satisfaction. The loan, the necklace, the dress. It was all part of the same transaction. He was tidying up his conscience, balancing the scales before he made his exit. And in that moment, looking at his satisfied face, the cold shock inside me began to crystallize into something else, something sharp and determined. He thought I was a passive participant in this story, the unsuspecting wife to be gently maneuvered off stage. But the woman he had married, the one who had worked 2 jobs to put him through graduate school, the one who had fought like a lioness for our son when he was sick, that woman was still in here, buried under 35 years of love and trust, and she was starting to wake up. She had no idea. Oh, David, you have no idea. The cold weight of the diamond was a constant, chilling reminder against my skin as we drove home in a silence so thick it felt like a third person in the car. David reached over and rested his hand on my knee, a habitual gesture of possession and comfort that now made my flesh crawl. I didn't pull away. I let it sit there, a dead weight, while I stared out the window at the blur of streetlights, each one a passing witness to the death of my marriage. He hummed along to the soft jazz on the radio, a tune I didn't recognize, and I wondered if it was a song he listened to with her, if this entire performance, the dinner, the necklace, the gentle hum, was a routine he'd perfected in a life I knew nothing about. When we pulled into the driveway of the house we'd bought together, the house where we'd raised our son, where we'd buried the family dog under the old oak tree, it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a crime scene, and I was the sole detective, working in the shadows. He unlocked the door, holding it open for me with a gallant sweep of his arm. "After you, my love," he said, and the endearment was a shard of glass in my heart. I walked inside, my heels clicking on the familiar hardwood floors, and headed straight for the kitchen, needing a barrier, a task, between us. I'm just gonna get a glass of water, I said, my voice thankfully steady. Want one? No, I'm fine, he said, already shrugging off his suit jacket, draping it over the back of his favorite armchair as he moved towards his study. I've just got to check a few emails before bed. Don't wait up. Emails. The word was a trigger. I stood at the kitchen sink, the cold water running over my motionless hands, and I watched his shadow move under the study door. The loan is approved. The words echoed, taunting me. What loan? From where? My mind, once fogged with shock, was now clicking into a sharp, painful clarity. I thought of our joint accounts, the retirement funds we'd meticulously built, the college fund for Michael we'd finally closed out last year. He couldn't have touched those without me knowing, could he? This was something else, something separate. A secret line of credit? A second mortgage? The house was in both our names. He'd need my signature. Unless he'd forged it. The thought was so monstrous, so coldly calculating that my legs went weak. I gripped the edge of the countertop, the cool granite a grounding force. I couldn't fall apart. Not yet. I had to know. I had to see. I heard the soft click of his study door opening and quickly shut off the water, grabbing a glass and filling it, my back to him. Heading up, he said, his voice laced with a false, weary warmth. Big day tomorrow. I turned, forcing a soft smile. Okay, dear. Sleep well. I waited until I heard his footsteps on the stairs, the creak of the third step from the top that we'd always meant to fix, and then the soft click of our bedroom door closing. The house was silent, a museum of our life together. I stood there in the dark kitchen for a long time, the only light coming from the digital clock on the stove. 11:47 p.m. My anniversary was over. The fight for my life had begun. With a resolve that felt both foreign and familiar, I moved silently toward his study. The door was unlocked. I slipped inside, the scent of his leather chair and old paper enveloping me. This was his sanctuary, a place I'd always respected. Now it felt like the enemy's command center. His laptop was gone, taken upstairs with him. But he was a creature of habit, a man who trusted paper. My eyes scanned the room, landing on the locked filing cabinet in the corner. The small brass key was, as it always had been, taped to the underside of the third bookshelf from the door. My hand didn't even tremble as I reached for it. The lock turned with a soft, definitive thunk. I pulled open the top drawer, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. And there it was, nestled between old tax returns and the deed to the house, a French green hanging folder I'd never seen before. On the tab, in David's precise block letters, was a single word, promissory. I lifted the file out, its weight insignificant in my hands, yet it felt heavier than any burden I had ever carried. I didn't open it. Not yet. I just stood there, in the quiet dark, holding the physical proof of my husband's betrayal. The cold diamond on my neck gleaming in the moonlight slanting through the window. He was in our bed, sleeping soundly, dreaming of his escape. And I was down here, in the ruins of our life, holding the map to his secret. My fingers trembled as I lifted the cover of the folder, the smooth cardboard feeling like a scalpel poised to cut open the last intact part of my life. The first page was a cover letter from a financial institution I'd never heard of, Apex Liberty Lending, with a logo that looked cheap, almost predatory. The words blurred before my eyes, then snapped into a horrifying crystalline clarity. Promissory note, it stated at the top. And then the amount, $250,000. The number seemed to leap off the page, a monstrous figure that stole the air from my lungs. I leaned against the cold metal of the filing cabinet, my legs refusing to hold me. $250,000? It was more than we'd paid for this house. It was a life-changing sum, a sum that spoke not of a desperate need, but of a planned, deliberate new beginning. For someone else. My eyes, stinging with tears I refused to shed, scanned down the page. The borrower? David Robert Evans. The terms, the interest rate, it all washed over me in a meaningless torrent of financial jargon until I reached the bottom, the section for the cosigner. And there it was, my name, Linda Marie Evans, and beneath it a signature that was a near-perfect replica of my own. He had practiced. The thought was a fresh, searing wound. My husband had sat at this very desk, perhaps while I was downstairs making his dinner, and had carefully traced the loops and lines of my signature, the one I'd used to sign our marriage license, the one on the birth certificates of our children. He had forged my identity to fund his escape. The violation was so profound, so intimate, it felt like a physical violation. I shuffled to the next page, a loan application. His income was listed, inflated by 20%. Our assets were detailed, our home equity leveraged to the hilt. And in the section for purpose of loan, he had typed a single, bald-faced lie. Home renovations. I thought of the peeling paint on the back porch, the stove that had been limping along for a decade, the way he'd always said, "We'll get to it next year, Lynn. No need to go into debt." The hypocrisy was a poison. But it was the final document that broke the last of my heart into dust. It was a printout of a real estate listing, crumpled and then smoothed out, as if it had been carried in a pocket for a long time. It was for a condo, a sleek, modern one-bedroom with a balcony overlooking the river in a new development across town. The price was circled. It matched the loan amount almost to the dollar. And scribbled in the margin, in Patricia's unmistakable looping handwriting, was a note. D, our little secret. Can you imagine warnings here? Just us. P, our little secret. The phrase from the fitting room echoed, now given a home, a destination. I could imagine it. I could imagine them there in that sterile new building, drinking coffee on that balcony, building a life on the foundation of my shattered trust and $250,000 of debt he had stuck me with. The quiet of the house was no longer peaceful, it was accusatory. Every creak was a reminder of the life being stolen from me. I stood there, holding the evidence of my own financial annihilation, and a strange, cold calm began to settle over the raw panic. The tears dried up, the shaking stopped. This was no longer just about a broken heart, this was about survival. He had not just left me for another woman, he had attempted to bankrupt me, to leave me destitute in the home we'd built together, buried under a mountain of fraudulent debt he had stuck me with. I carefully, methodically, placed every page back into the folder exactly as I had found it. I closed the drawer, turned the lock, and pressed the key back into its hiding place. Then I walked to the bookshelf, and my fingers trailed over the spines of our photo albums, the letter-bound volumes of Michael's first steps, our anniversaries, Christmases, vacations. They were no longer records of a happy life, they were evidence of the lie I had been living. I went upstairs, each step a conscious act of will. The door to our bedroom was ajar. I pushed it open and saw him lying in our bed, asleep on his side, his breathing deep and even. The moonlight fell across his face, the face I had loved for most of my life, and I felt nothing but a vast, hollow coldness. I changed into my nightgown in the bathroom, the diamond necklace catching the light. I took it off, the clasp cold in my fingers, and I didn't put it in my jewelry box. I hid it in the very back of my sock drawer, a trophy from a battle he didn't yet know was being waged. Then I slipped into bed beside him, lying on my side, my back to him, putting as much distance between us as the king-size mattress would allow. I didn't sleep. I stared at the digital clock on my nightstand, watching the red numbers change, each minute a tiny lifetime, 117, 118, 119. And as I lay there in the dark next to the stranger who had stolen my name and my future, a plan began to form in the ruins of my heart. It was not a plan of hysterics or confrontation. It was quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. He thought he was the only one with secrets. He was wrong. Tomorrow, I would begin to gather my own weapons. The first light of dawn was a pale, reluctant gray seeping through the blinds, painting stripes of weak light across the floor, and the man sleeping beside me. I had not slept, not for a single second. The night had been a long, cold vigil. My mind, a whirlwind of calculations, of remembered conversations, of sifting through 3.5 decades for clues I had been too trusting, too loved to ever see. The warmth of the bed was a lie. The soft rhythm of David's breathing, a soundtrack to my quiet unraveling. When the clock finally glowed 6 a.m., I moved with a precision that felt both alien and innate. I slipped out from under the covers, my body stiff with tension and unshed tears, and padded silently into the bathroom. I avoided my own gaze in the mirror, afraid of the stranger who would look back. The woman with the hollow eyes and a forge of cold iron where her heart used to be. I dressed in soft, quiet clothes, the kind that wouldn't whisper my movements, and went downstairs. The house was a tomb of memories, every object a silent witness. The coffee maker gurgled to life, its normal morning sound now a grotesque parody of domesticity. I needed to be normal. I needed to be Linda. I poured 2 mugs, adding a spoonful of sugar to his, just the way he liked it, my hand steady as a surgeon's. The routine was my armor. He came down 20 minutes later, dressed for work, his tie perfectly knotted. He smiled at me, a casual morning smile, and my soul recoiled. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. He leaned in to kiss my cheek, and I turned my head slightly at the last second, so his lips only grazed my hair. "Coffee's ready," I said, my voice carefully neutral. I handed him his mug. Our fingers brushed. I didn't flinch. I studied him. Really studied him, as he blew on the steam and scanned the headlines on his tablet. This was the man who cried when Michael took his first steps, who held my hand through chemo when my sister Helen was sick, who had built a fence around the garden because the wabbits were eating my roses. When had that man been replaced by this one? This stranger who could forge my name and plan a future with my best friend. He was talking about his day, a meeting with a client named Robert, a lunch with the partners. Every word was a potential lie. Was he meeting Patricia? Was the client the banker from Apex Liberty Lending? I nodded in all the right places, making a non-committal sound as I buttered my toast. "And you?" he asked, taking a sip of coffee. "What are your plans today?" It was an innocent question, one he asked almost every day. Today, it felt like an interrogation. He was checking. He was making sure I would be in my usual orbits, out of his way. The usual," I said, my tone light, breezy. "I've got a grocery run, and I thought I might finally start sorting through those boxes in the attic. It's been years." The attic. The one place in the house he never went. A repository of forgotten things. A perfect place to think, to plan, to hide. A flicker of something. Relief crossed his face. "That's a big job. Don't overdo it." He finished his coffee, set the mug in the sink, and came around the island to kiss me goodbye. This time I let him. His lips were warm on mine, a familiar sensation that now felt like a violation. "I love you, Linda," he said, his eyes meeting mine. And for a terrifying second, I saw it. A shadow of the man I'd married, a ghost of genuine feeling in the blue depths. Or was I just seeing what I desperately wanted to see? Was I trying to find an excuse for him, even now? "I love you too, David," I whispered back, the words ash in my mouth. He smiled, a satisfied, unburdened smile, and turned to leave. I stood at the kitchen window, watching his car back out of the driveway and disappear down the street. The moment the taillights vanished, the performance ended. The pleasant, wifely mask dissolved from my face, leaving only the cold, hard reality beneath. I was alone, and I had work to do. My first call wasn't to a lawyer, not yet. That would come with a paper trail, with questions I wasn't ready to answer. My first call was to my son. I needed to hear his voice, to touch the one pure, unspoiled thing that had come from our union. I dialed his number, my heart pounding a different, more familiar rhythm of maternal anxiety. Mom? Hey, everything okay? Michael's voice, warm and slightly distracted, was a lifeline. Everything's fine, honey, I said, forcing a brightness I didn't feel. I had a dream about you last night. Just wanted to hear your voice. We talked for 10 minutes about his work, his girlfriend, Sarah, his plans to visit next month. Every word was a blessing and a torture. He had no idea the foundation of his family was crumbling to dust. I couldn't tell him. Not until I knew what I was dealing with. Not until I had a plan to protect him, to protect what was left. After I hung up, I stood in the silent kitchen, the weight of my isolation pressing in on me. Then I climbed the stairs to the attic, not to sort through old boxes, but to find a quiet place to wage a war he didn't know had begun. The attic air was thick and still, heavy with the scent of mothballs and forgotten years, a stark contrast to the sterile coldness that had taken root in my chest. Dust motes danced in the slants of light cutting through the single grimy window, illuminating a landscape of memories stacked in cardboard tombs. I didn't start with the boxes marked Xmas or baby clothes. I went straight for the one in the far corner, labeled in my own neat handwriting, Taxes and Important, 1985-2005. It was a time capsule from a life built on trust, and I was about to ransack it for weapons. My hands were not gentle as I ripped the brittle packing tape away. The first thing I saw was the manila envelope containing the deed to our first home, a tiny starter house we'd bought with so much hope it felt like a physical force. Beneath it were old passports, his and mine, tucked together. I pulled them out. In the photo from 1990, David's face was younger, his hair thicker, his smile open and unguarded. I traced the image with a trembling finger, remembering the man who had held the camera for my photo, making silly faces until I'd finally laughed, a real, unforced laugh that the passport photo had perfectly captured. We looked happy. We were happy, weren't we? The question was a pit opening inside me. Had it all been a lie? Had the last 20 years been a slow, meticulous performance? I shoved the passports aside, my grief hardening into something more useful, anger. I dug deeper, past birth certificates and immunization records until my fingers closed around a thick, bound booklet. Our first joint loan application. For this very house. I spread it out on the dusty floorboards, the familiar figures a stark contrast to the predatory document now locked in his study downstairs. Our combined income was modest. Our debts were carefully listed. Our signatures, side by side, were a pact. We had sat at our old Formica kitchen table, filling this out together, his hand covering my own when I'd worried aloud about the amount. "We're in this together, Lynn," he'd said. Always. The memory was a fresh wound. I compared the signatures. My real one from then, with its hopeful, looping L, and the forged one from the promissory note, a colder, more precise imitation. He had gotten better at being deceptive. My eyes scanned the old documents, not for nostalgia, but for patterns, for clues. And then I found it. Tucked behind a stack of paid-off car loan papers was a single, folded sheet that didn't belong. It was a receipt from a jewelry store. Not the one where he'd bought the diamond necklace, but a smaller, independent place in the city I knew Patricia frequented. The date was from 8 months ago. The item purchased was a lady's gold bracelet. The price was substantial, and it was paid for with a credit card I didn't recognize. The last 4 digits were not from any of our joint accounts. My breath caught. This was it, the first tangible financial thread connecting him to her, a thread he'd thought was buried forever under the weight of 2 decades of paper. This wasn't just about a secret loan for a condo. It was about a secret life, funded by secret means. He had been spending money on her for months, maybe longer. The bracelet was just what he'd kept a record of. What else was there? I carefully folded the receipt and slipped it into the pocket of my pants. It was a small thing, a sliver of evidence, but it was mine. I felt a grim sense of power, the first I'd felt since I heard his whisper in the fitting room. I was no longer just the victim. I was the archivist of my own betrayal, collecting the receipts for a case I never wanted to bring. I repacked the box, leaving everything exactly as I had found it except for the one crucial slip of paper burning a hole in my pocket. As I descended the attic stairs back into the main house, the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was waiting. He thought he held all the secrets, but I was just beginning to uncover my own. The receipt in my pocket felt like a live wire, humming with a dangerous, electric truth. I walked back into our kitchen, the scene of so many ordinary mornings, and now it felt like the headquarters of a resistance movement with a membership of one. The coffee I had made earlier was cold and bitter in the pot, a perfect mirror of the taste in my mouth. I poured it down the sink, watching the dark liquid swirl away, and wished it were that easy to wash away the poison of David's deception. My mind was no longer reeling. It was plotting, moving with a cold, focused clarity I didn't know I possessed. The bracelet receipt was a clue, but it was from 8 months ago. I needed current intelligence. I needed to understand the scope of the secret financial life he'd built. I had to get back into his study, but he was a creature of habit, and his habits were now my greatest asset. He would be at work for at least another 6 hours. I had time, but I couldn't be reckless. I moved through the house, performing the mundane rituals of my day, making the bed, loading the dishwasher, all while my mind was in his study, picking the locks of his digital life. The grocery run I'd mentioned was a necessary alibi. I drove to the store, my hands clenched on the steering wheel, and moved through the aisles like an automaton, filling the cart with items I didn't want and a life I no longer recognized. I chose a cut of steak he liked, then put it back, a small, petty rebellion that sent a grim flicker of satisfaction through me. On the way home, I didn't turn into our driveway. I drove past it, my heart hammering, and circled the block, my eyes scanning for any sign of his car, any indication he'd come home unexpectedly. The coast was clear. Back inside, I didn't hesitate. I went straight to his study, the brass key cold and familiar in my hand. This time, I wasn't looking for the promissory file. I was looking for something else, something older. I opened the lower drawer, the one that held files from his old solo practice, before he merged with a larger firm. I shuffled through folders labeled with the names of defunct clients until I found what I was looking for, a sleek, black, pocket-sized address book. David was digitally savvy for his age, but he was also paranoid about losing contacts. He kept a physical backup, a habit from the early days of his career. I flipped it open, my pulse quickening.
There, under P, was what I needed. Not just Patricia's home number, but her cell phone, scribbled in the margin with a little star next to it. And below it, another entry that made my blood run cold. Apex Liberty, Greg, with a direct line. So Greg was a person, not just a logo, a person David spoke to directly. I committed the number to memory, the digits etching themselves into my brain beside the amount of the loan and the image of that riverfront condo. I slipped the address book back into its precise place, closed and locked the drawer. The forge in my mind was heating up, hammering a new plan into shape. I couldn't confront him yet. I needed more. I needed to understand the money. I needed to see the flow of it, from Apex Liberty to him to her. I went to the kitchen landline, the one whose bill came to the house, a bill I paid. I picked up the receiver, my finger hovering over the keypad. I wasn't ready to call Greg, but there was someone else I could call. I dialed Patricia's cell number. It rang, once, twice. My throat tightened. What would I say? Could I keep the betrayal, the sheer volcanic rage out of my voice? Hello? Her voice was bright, cheerful. It was the voice that had laughed with me over 1,000 glasses of wine. the voice that had comforted me when my father died. Now it was the voice of the enemy. "Patricia, hi, it's Linda," I said, and I was amazed at how normal I sounded, a pleasant, slightly distracted warmth coloring my tone. "Oh, Linda, happy anniversary. How was the big dinner?" The casual mention of our anniversary was a knife twist. "It was wonderful," I gushed, layering on the performance. "David completely surprised me. He's just been so thoughtful lately." I let the word hang, a bated heck. There was the briefest of pauses on the other end of the line, a heartbeat of silence that screamed volumes. "Has he?" she said, her voice a fraction too high. That's great, Lynn. He's a good man." "He's a good man." The words were so laden with intimate knowledge, so patronizing, that I had to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. "He is," I agreed, my smile audible in my voice. "Listen, the reason I'm calling, I'm trying to track down a charge on our credit card from a few months back, a jewelry store, Silver Treasures. I don't recognize it, and David's so busy, he's useless with these things. You know how men are. You haven't heard him mention it, have you? Maybe he bought a gift for one of the secretaries at work?" The lie flowed easily, a toxic stream. I held my breath. This was the test. If she was guilty, she would panic. She would over-explain. She would reveal herself. There was another silence, longer this time. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, the frantic calculation. "Silver treasures?" she repeated slowly. No, I don't think so. Can't help you there, sorry. It was probably just a business thing. You know how they write everything off?" Her voice was too smooth, too dismissive. She was lying. She knew about the bracelet because she was wearing it. The confirmation was a cold splash of water. There was no more doubt. The friendship was a carcass picked clean by vultures. We chatted for another minute about nothing, a conversation of ghosts, and when I hung up, I was shaking, but not with sadness, with purpose. I had my confirmation. Now I needed my weapon, the secret credit card. I had to find it.
The silence after I hung up the phone was deafening, a stark void where the echo of Patricia's lie still hung, a poisonous cloud in my own kitchen. She knew. The simple, brutal certainty of it solidified the last of my crumbling resolve. This was no longer a suspicion. It was a war, and I had just identified the second combatant. The secret credit card was the key, the linchpin connecting David's hidden financial life to his hidden romantic one. I had to find it. He was too careful to leave it in his wallet, which he often left on his dresser. He wouldn't keep it in his study, not after my near discovery of the loan documents. My eyes swept the room, landing on the worn leather briefcase propped against the leg of his desk. It was his old one, the one he claimed was his lucky case from when he'd landed his first major client. He used it for sentimental occasions like anniversary dinners or, I now realized, for meetings where he needed to feel confident, unscrupulous. I crossed the room and lifted it. It was heavy. I laid it flat on his desk, my fingers fumbling with the brass clasps. They snapped open with a sound like gunshots in the quiet room. Inside, nestled amid a few stray pens and a legal pad, was a sleek black leather wallet, different from the brown one he carried every day. My heart thudded against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of dread and anticipation. I picked it up. It was thin, holding only what was necessary. I opened it, and there it was, a titanium card, cold and sleek, embossed with his name, Mr. David R. Evans. The account number was the one from the bracelet receipt.
This was the engine of his deception, the tool he used to finance his new life while still sharing a bed with me. I slid the card out of its slot. It felt heavy with the weight of his betrayal, with the price of steaks and theater tickets and gold bracelets I never received. But it wasn't enough to just hold it. I needed proof. I needed a record.
I pulled my phone from my pocket, my hands trembling now, not with fear, but with a furious, focused energy. I opened the camera app and laid the card on his clean, white legal pad. I took a picture of the front, then the back, making sure the raised numbers and his name were stark and clear. The flash illuminated the dark grain of his desk, a sudden, stark spotlight on his secret. I then carefully placed everything back exactly as I had found it, closing the clasps on the briefcase, returning it to its precise spot against the desk leg. The images on my phone felt more valuable than the diamond necklace hidden in my sock drawer. This was no longer about my broken heart. It was about evidence. It was about building a case against the man I loved, brick by painful brick, until the wall between us was so high and so thick that I could finally, safely, tear it all down. The cold, sleek image of the credit card on my phone screen was a totem of his duplicity, a digital scar on the heart of my marriage. I stood in the center of his study, the air thick with the scent of his cologne and treason, and I knew I couldn't stay in this house another moment with the evidence burning a hole in my pocket and my sanity. I needed air. I needed space to think, to plan, away from the oppressive weight of these familiar walls that had witnessed every lie. Grabbing my purse and keys, I fled the house, the slam of the front door behind me feeling less like an exit and more like a cell door closing. I drove without a destination, my hands tight on the wheel, the suburban landscape I'd called home for decades blurring into a meaningless smear of green lawns and identical rooftops. I ended up at Miller's Point, a rocky overlook on the edge of town where David and I had come as teenagers to watch the sunset and dream about a future that, in his mind, had apparently expired. I killed the engine and stared out at the river, the same river that flowed past the condo he'd chosen for his new life. The wind whipped my hair, a clean, sharp cold that felt more honest than the stifling warmth of our home. Sitting there with the vastness of the sky above me, the sheer scale of his betrayal threatened to swallow me whole. $250,000, a secret credit card, a forged signature, a best friend of 30 years. It was a pyramid of deceit, each layer more audacious than the last. And for what? A view of the water with Patricia? The thought was so banal, so pathetic, it curdled the sorrow in my gut into something harder, something sharper. My phone, the very device holding the proof of his other life, felt heavy in my hand. I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I couldn't be the sole archivist of this catastrophe. I needed a witness. I needed someone to look at the facts and tell me I wasn't crazy, that this was as monstrous as it felt. With a resolve that came from a place deeper than pain, I scrolled through my contacts, not to a friend, not to my sister Helen, but to a number I'd programmed in years ago during a scare with a neighbor's boundary dispute, the law offices of Brennan and Shaw. I asked for Martha Brennan, the firm's founding partner, a woman with a reputation for being thorough and utterly ruthless in family law. I was put on hold, the tinny classical music a surreal soundtrack to the end of my life as I knew it. Martha Brennan, a voice answered, crisp and efficient, devoid of the emotional static clogging my own head. Ms. Brennan, I began, my voice surprisingly steady, a calm facade over a roiling ocean. My name is Linda Evans. I believe my husband is systematically defrauding me and preparing to leave our marriage. He has taken out a substantial loan in my name without my knowledge, and I have reason to believe he is dissipating marital assets. The words were clinical, legal, and speaking them aloud made the nightmare terrifyingly real. I was no longer just a betrayed wife. I was a client. There was a brief pause on the other end, the sound of a pen being picked up. I see, Martha Brennan said, her tone not sympathetic, but interested. That is a serious allegation. What evidence do you have currently? I have a photograph of a secret credit card in his name linked to an account I am not on. I have the loan documents, which include my forged signature. I have a receipt for a significant jewelry purchase from that card, made 8 months ago, and I have contextual evidence of his affair with a long-term family friend. The words affair and forged signature felt alien in my mouth, like stones I was forced to swallow. "Do not confront him," she said immediately, her voice sharp with authority. "Do not let him know you are aware of anything. Your priority now is to secure and document everything you can. Financial records, bank statements, credit reports, any unusual transactions. Can you access your joint accounts online?" "Yes," I whispered, feeling a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. This was really happening. "Good. Do so from a secure device, not your home computer. Print everything and bring it to my office. We will need to move quickly, Mrs. Evans. Once he realizes you are aware, he may attempt to hide or move assets. The forged signature on a loan is particularly egregious. We have grounds for an immediate restraining order freezing those accounts and for a claim of fraud." An immediate restraining order. The phrase was so final, so legal and cold. It would be the first public shot in our private war, a line drawn in the sand that could never be erased. I agreed to her terms, my mind reeling, and set an appointment for the following afternoon. When I hung up, I sat in the car for a long time, watching the river flow relentlessly towards the sea. I had just hired a lawyer. I had just set in motion the legal machinery that would dismantle the life we had built. The wind howled outside, but inside the car, there was only the sound of my own breathing and the terrible, quiet click of the last lock on my marriage snapping shut.
The drive home from Miller's Point was a journey through a ghost landscape, every familiar landmark now viewed through the lens of impending loss. Martha Brennan's words, "Do not confront him," played on a loop in my mind, a mantra that required a level of acting I wasn't sure I possessed. I had to walk back into that house and be Linda, the trusting, unassuming Linda, while inside, a stranger named Mrs. Evans was preparing for battle. When I pulled into the driveway, David's car was already there, a sight that once sparked a flicker of comfort and now only ignited a cold dread. I sat for a moment watching the warm light glowing from our kitchen window and practiced smiling in the rearview mirror. It was a grim, terrifying thing. I walked inside, the scent of garlic and onions hitting me. He was cooking. "In here, Lynn," he called from the kitchen. I found him at the stove, stirring a pan of spaghetti sauce, an apron tied around his waist. He looked domestic, devoted, a perfect picture of a loving husband. The dissonance was so violent it made me nauseous. "You're home early," I said, my voice carefully neutral as I set my purse down. "Cleared my desk," he said, smiling over his shoulder. "Thought I'd make my famous sauce. Comfort food, you know. You seemed a little quiet this morning." He was monitoring me. My quietness had registered. I had to be better. I moved to the refrigerator, needing to hide my face, and pulled out a head of lettuce for a salad. "Just tired," I murmured. The attic was stuffy, and then I went for a drive to clear my head. "Everything okay?" he asked, his tone laced with a gentle concern that felt like a razor blade wrapped in velvet. This was the dance now, every word a potential misstep. "Everything's fine," I said, meeting his gaze and forcing a softness into my eyes I did not feel. "Just a lot of memories in those boxes, that's all." It was the truth, and he accepted it, nodding as he turned back to his sauce. "We've built a good life here, Lynn," he said, his back to me, and the profound hypocrisy of the statement nearly broke me. I focused on tearing the lettuce, the crisp, destructive sound a satisfying substitute for what I wanted to do to his lies. During dinner, he was overly attentive, filling my wine glass, asking about my day with a focused interest that felt foreign and manipulative. I spoke about the grocery store, about a sale on tomatoes, about nothing of consequence, all while my mind was in Martha Brennan's office speaking the language of restraining orders and fraud. I watched his hands, the same hands that had forged my name, now carefully twirling spaghetti onto his fork, and I wondered if he felt the ghost of that pen in his fingers. Later, as we got ready for bed, the routine felt like a sacrilege. Brushing our teeth side by side in the bathroom we'd shared for 20 years, I watched him in the mirror.
He caught my eye and smiled, a stripe of toothpaste at the corner of his mouth. "What?" he asked. "Just looking at you," I said softly, and it was the truth. I was memorizing the face of the man I was about to destroy, searching for one last trace of the boy I'd fallen in love with, and finding only the skilled, chilling mask of a stranger. In the dark, lying beside him, the space between us felt vast enough to hold the entire ocean I'd looked at that afternoon. I could feel the heat of his body, a warmth that had once been my shelter and was now a prison. I stared at the ceiling, my mind no longer racing with panic, but moving with the cold, deliberate steps of a strategy. Tomorrow, I would go to the library. I would use a public computer, as Martha Brennan had instructed, and I would begin to pull the financial threads of our life, one by one, until the whole rotten tapestry unraveled in my hands. He thought he was the only one with secrets. He thought he was the only one with the plan. But as his breathing deepened into sleep beside me, I was already wide awake, plotting my countermove in the silent, patient dark. The morning light felt different, thinner, as if it were illuminating a stage set that was about to be struck. I moved through the rituals of breakfast with David with a robotic precision, my smile a practiced, fleeting thing that never reached my eyes. He was in a good mood, whistling as he gathered his things, his briefcase, the sleek black betrayer's briefcase, in his hand. He kissed my cheek, a dry, perfunctory gesture, and told me he'd be late, a dinner with a potential investor from out of town. I didn't ask for a name. I just nodded, my mind already miles away in the sterile quiet of the public library. The moment his car disappeared, I was in motion. I dressed in neutral, forgettable clothes, a ghost preparing to haunt the digital records of her own life. I drove to the library on the other side of town, a place of hushed tones and echoing footsteps, a world away from the emotional carnage of my home. I found an isolated computer terminal in a corner, the screen cool and impersonal. My hands were steady as I typed in the web address for our primary bank, the one we'd used since we were first married. I clicked Forgot Password, had a temporary code sent to my phone, and created a new one, something strong and unique he would never guess. I was locking him out of our shared life, one digital door at a time. The screen populated with our accounts. The checking and savings were there, their balances familiar, seemingly untouched. But it was the credit card section that made my blood run cold. There, listed beside our joint card, was another, the titanium card. It wasn't just a physical object. It was a fully active, separate account with a credit limit of $50,000. The current balance was staggering. I scrolled through the transactions, each one a tiny, meticulous record of my husband's double life. There were charges for expensive dinners at restaurants I'd never heard of, for hotel stays in the city on nights he told me he was working late, for flights, not one, but two, to Sarasota, Florida. In February, he told me he was at a conference in Chicago. My vision blurred, the numbers swimming on the screen. But it was the recurring charges that formed the most damning pattern. A monthly subscription for a premium streaming service, a gym membership at an elite club across town, and a series of payments to a florist, the Gilded Lily, each one made on the 13th of the month. Patricia's birthday was on the 13th of May. Did he send her flowers every month? The thought was so deliberately romantic, so calculatedly persistent, it felt more intimate and more violating than the evidence of the hotel rooms. I clicked print, the machine whirring to life in the quiet corner. Page after page slid into the tray, a chronicle of deceit, written in the bland language of commerce. I then pulled our credit report. It was there, listed under Accounts in Your Name. The Apex Liberty Loan, a monstrous $250,000 entry. Seeing it on an official document, next to my Social Security number, made me feel physically ill. He hadn't just stolen my signature. He had stolen my financial identity. I gathered the warm, freshly printed pages, their heat a mockery of the ice in my veins.
I held in my hands the complete financial blueprint of David's betrayal. The secret life wasn't so secret anymore. It was itemized, dated, and priced. As I drove to Martha Brennan's office, the stack of papers on the passenger seat felt like a lead weight. I was no longer just a woman with a suspicion. I was a client walking into a lawyer's office with a suitcase full of evidence. I was about to make my nightmare legally, officially real. The war was no longer cold. It was about to begin.
The mahogany door to Martha Brennan's office closed behind me with a soft final click, sealing me into a new reality. The warm, printed pages of our financial ruin were now stacked neatly on her desk, a monument to the life I was leaving behind. Martha, a woman with sharp eyes and a demeanor of unshakable calm, had reviewed them without flinching. "This is excellent, Linda," she said, her voice devoid of pity, filled only with a professional, grim satisfaction. "The forgery is clear. The dissipation of assets is documented. We have him." The words were a victory, but they felt like a sentence. She drafted the papers immediately. A petition for divorce on the grounds of fraud, constructive abandonment, and adultery, coupled with an emergency motion to freeze the Apex Liberty loan account and the secret credit card. Serving him at work was her idea. "It limits the theatrics," she said. "It establishes control." I didn't go home. I drove to a small extended-stay hotel on the other side of the river, a bland, anonymous box where I could fall apart without an audience. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, the floral bedspread scratchy under my hands, and I waited. My phone sat silent for an hour, then 2. The silence was more agonizing than any outburst. Finally, as the afternoon light began to fade, it rang. His name flashed on the screen. I took a deep, shuddering breath and answered. "Linda." His voice was a wreck, a hollowed-out shell of the confident man from this morning. What is this? A process server just in front of my partners." He was gasping, struggling for air. "You knew?" "I knew," I said, my voice quiet, steady, and terribly calm. "I knew in the fitting room, David. I heard you on the phone. The loan is approved. She has no idea." The line went so silent, I thought he hung up. Then a raw, broken sound. "Linda, my God, Patricia, it's not what you think." "Don't," I cut him off, the first spark of anger igniting in the void. "I have the receipt for the bracelet. I have the transaction history from the secret card. I have the real estate listing for your condo. I have it all. You didn't just leave me. You tried to rob me blind on your way out." The truth laid bare between us was an impassable chasm. He began to sob, great, heaving sobs that spoke of panic and unraveling control, not remorse. He begged, he pleaded, he blamed a midlife crisis, the stress of work. He even blamed me for the distance he said had grown between us. I listened to it all, saying nothing, each excuse another nail in the coffin of our marriage. When his words finally dissolved into incoherent weeping, I spoke the last words I would ever say to him as his wife. "My lawyer will be in touch. Do not contact me again." The divorce was not a battle. It was a surrender on his part. The evidence was too overwhelming. He signed the papers, relinquishing all claim to the house, agreeing to a full division of the remaining assets, and taking sole responsibility for the Apex Liberty loan. The judge, upon reviewing the forgery, referred the case for potential criminal charges. I didn't push for it. Some ruins are best left buried. I moved back into the house. It was too big, too quiet, filled with the ghosts of a life that had been a lie. It took months before I could sleep through the night, years before the sound of a phone ringing didn't send a jolt of dread through my system. I had a single, stilted conversation with Patricia, who offered a tearful, self-serving apology before I hung up on her, severing the last tie to that old life. But time, as it does, began to do its work. My son, Michael, became my anchor. His steady, unwavering love, a constant reminder that not everything from my marriage had been a failure. I started gardening again, my hands in the soil, nurturing new life from the ground. I took a pottery class, something I'd always wanted to do, and found a strange, solid peace in the spinning of the wheel and the feel of wet clay. On a bright, crisp autumn morning 5 years later, I was in the garden, cutting the last of the season's roses. The past no longer felt like an open wound, but a scar. Tough, resilient, a part of me, but no longer defining me. The house was truly mine now, filled with my things, my peace, my hard-won solitude. I had learned that forgiveness wasn't about absolving him of what he did. It was about releasing myself from the prison of his betrayal. The loan was paid, the divorce was final, the secret was out, and I, Linda Evans, was finally, completely, and quietly free.